Good afternoon, and welcome to the fifth event in our Women Speaker Series, The Future is Intersectional Black Women Interrogating Technology. I am very excited about the speaker that we have today, Dr. Timnit Gebru. My name is Tamara Pearson. I am the Director of the Center of Excellence for Minority Women in STEM here at Spelman College. I'm also a Spelman alumna. Right after I graduated from Spelman College in 1996, I started a doctoral program in computer science with dreams of a career at Pixar, that powerhouse behind Toy Story, which had just been released the year before. I was one of only 2 Black graduate students in the computer science department at the University of Florida, and the only one in the doctoral program. There were no Black faculty. After 2 years, I switched to another department, education, because the prospect of a lifetime of being the only one was more than I was ready to take on at that time. But our speaker today, Dr. Timnit Gebru, is not me. She represents one of the 1.5% of doctoral degrees in engineering held by Black women. She was, until recently, one of the 1.6% of Google employees who are Black women, and one of the 0.9% of tech industry managers that are Black women. And just for a little context, Black women comprise 7.7% of the population. But most importantly, she is highly respected as a groundbreaking researcher in AI ethics, which investigates the quality of the predictions made using artificial intelligence. She specifically focuses on the impact of algorithmic bias on marginalized communities and unapologetically advocates for those communities. On December 2nd of last year, Timnit tweeted that she had been fired from Google, setting off a backlash against the company. On December 7th, I emailed her asking her to speak at Spelman College. She doesn't know this, but her powerful decision to not stay silent was the inspiration for this entire speaker series. So that is why I am so excited that we finally have her with us here today. And although there is continued disagreement about whether Dr. Gebru was fired or resigned, one thing is clear. Her experience shines a light on an industry that struggles to retain Black women. But what we are fighting against is about more than increased numbers. As Joy Buolamwini, founder of the Algorithmic Justice League and featured star of the new documentary Coded Bias, responded to Timnit's tweet with, to be bold, to be honest, to know your worth, to speak up for others, to do the thankless work, to pioneer the way, to suffer no fools, to be all they could only wish to be, wrapped in Black womanhood, is an affront to those who would rather see us cower than own our power. With that, I am honored to introduce the woman who is pioneering a way for all of us, Dr. Timnit Gebru.
I didn't know all of that. It's I'm almost tearing up because that was one of the nicest introductions anybody has ever done for me. Thank you so much. And
It's my pleasure.
you know, before I start my talk, because this is Spelman, I wanted to talk about a program um, that we are launching. So I wanted to show you guys something if I can do this. So my can everybody see this? You can see my screen, I hope. Okay. So my colleague Lynn Champy, who is just finishing her a PhD at Stanford, spearheaded this program. So we have this Black Air Summer Research Grant Program that is for research that is led by Black women. And so I'll send the link on the chat. So the deadline to apply is sometime, and I think September 23rd. And you just fill out a one-page research proposal, and you would have $1,500 for to execute that research proposal. And there will be a bunch of mentors who would work with you to scope out your research proposal. Then you would you would then kind of present your research. And look who's one of the advisors, Brandy's Marshall, who is also at Spelman, and she was very instrumental in spearheading this program. And we're also working on a research institute. So I wanted to just put that in your radar because this is meant for people like you. Okay, cool. So now I'm gonna start my yes, thank you for having that. I'm gonna start my talk. So let me share my screen again. Um, I'm still thinking about your intro. It's just uh it really has put tears in my eyes. So thank you for for everything you said. And I wanted to talk today about the hierarchy of knowledge and machine learning. So I had prepared this talk a long time ago, a few months ago, because it kind of embodied a lot of the issues I was dealing with in my career, and probably some of the issues you were also dealing with when you had to leave the field and decided to focus on education. Not leaving the field, but understand what kind of stuff you had to work on in order to not be the only one, and not just be at the table, but be heard, and have the ability to lead and drive the conversation too. So I what I wanted to do today is just give you a little brief sketch of just a little bit about me and how this hierarchy of knowledge that I'm talking about manifests itself in my life, my education, and some of the things that I think we should do to combat it. So, oh yeah, so Ruha talked at this seminar before, and so actually my inspiration for this talk is many of the things she said. So she gave a talk at a conference called iClear, International Conference on Learning and Representation, where she said computational depth without historic or sociological depth is superficial learning, as opposed to deep learning. And she went on to explain what she meant, but then I also heard another conversation with her and Meredith Whitaker, who is also one of my inspirations because she's been doing a lot of organizing at Google while she was there and also after she got pushed out. And so Ruha was talking about how we have so many coding camps, but no social science boot camps for computer scientists. So this is kind of part of the hierarchy of knowledge, right? It tells us what we value in our society. We assume that everybody should learn how to code, but we don't assume the opposite about any form of social science. And this is true for me too. I am involved in a number of boot camps, coding boot camps, one of them being at Decoder, which is started by my colleague Jelani Nelson, and it's a 1 month coding boot camp for high school students in Ethiopia. Let me just look at the chat just in case that there's stuff I need to see. Oh, okay. So I want to, yeah, I was just looking at the chat to make sure there's nothing for me. So I was born and raised in Ethiopia in the capital city called Addis Ababa. And, you know, Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa. So it has about 110 million people. And my parents are Eritrean. So Eritrea is actually north of Ethiopia. It's a smaller country north of Ethiopia, but unfortunately, I think one third of Eritreans are outside of Eritrea. It's one of the countries with the highest migration rates outside of migration rates in the world. Oh man, I'm going on a tangent, but I think this is super important. And Eritreans, I mean, are going through so much at home and outside. For instance, Meron Estefanos, who's a refugee advocate, has this documentary called "The Sounds of Torture," which is about slave camps in Libya, and So that's a one documentary that I recommend if you have the mental space for it, just to understand that what kind of things that these Black people go through. Ayrshire was also colonized by the Italians, and I just recently found out that my grandfather's brother was essentially the Rosa Parks of Ertra, where they did the same thing, where like you had to sit at the back of the bus, and they wouldn't allow Eritreans education past the 5th grade. And he refused to not sit at the back of the bus, and was imprisoned because of it. But anyways, this is all this is all a tangent. But so I grew up in Ethiopia. I was born and raised in Addis, and I grew up enjoying math and physics, and I learned them of subjects that are disjoint from the world. So disjoint from all of these things, these other things that I was telling you about. So in 1998, there was a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and people of Eritrean descent were not safe in Ethiopia. So we either were deported, or we kind of hid and had to leave of our own volition. And I left, and I was randomly in Ireland at the time, because my sister was there, and waited to get political asylum in the U.S. My mom got all the paperwork done, and then I came to the U.S. So my first day of school in the U.S., by the way, my very first day of school, my chemistry teacher was like, the chemistry teacher said that, he said, I've met so many people like you who think they can just come from other countries and come here and take the hardest classes. And if you took the exams that these people take, you would fail. And I was like, okay. So I never took chemistry in high school. I just decided not to take it. So throughout all of this stuff, war and being a refugee and all of that, I just sort of tried to hold on to my education because I felt like it was something that I might have some control over. Another thing I love is dancing. I really miss it because of the pandemic, especially social dancing. So one of the things I was trying to figure out is why I felt like I um, learned how to dance sometimes better than some of these other subjects that I also liked, math and physics. In the classroom setting, I felt like I, the way I learned how to dance was more natural than the way I learned some of these other subjects. So I recently read an article or a blog post by Rachel Thomas, who co-founded Fast.ai, which is also a site I really like about neural networks. Their motto is "Make neural networks uncool again." So Rachel Thomas talks about this mathematician, Paul Lockhart, who he was a former professor at Brown, but he decided to quit and become a K-12 math teacher because he felt like we were teaching math all wrong. He likened it to, imagine if you, as a kid, you couldn't grow up to be able to sing songs without learning all of the, you know, notations and things like that. And so he thinks that that's how we teach math. People have to learn all these notations and all this stuff before they're able to see the big picture. And to me, that was the first time I kind of try to make a connection between music and, a math or science or engineering, etc. So like I said, I always thought of any form of social change as different and completely separate from any of these other subjects. And that's because I was taught to think that way. And so as an undergrad, I learned analog circuit design. So this is like the first lab class I took, I think. And so I was trying to try to make a connection between music, which I like, and engineering. And I tried to make this electrical piano key. So just this one key using oscillators and things like that. And on the right is, a desk I had at Apple. So my very first job out of college was at Apple in the audio team, because they were also people who liked music and were engineers at the same time. So while I was working at Apple on music, on audio and stuff, I also was working on analog to digital converters, and I just got interested in them in the abstract. I didn't really think about uh, their connection, what they were doing in the world. I didn't even care really if they were useful or not. I just found them interesting. And but later on, I started learning about why uh, these converters started getting very popular, or why certain ways of modulation that they use in these converters started getting popular, and has a lot to do with the wars and radar and decoding, etc. So again, all of these technologies that we talk about have a huge connection to war, which also was one of the biggest things that changed my life. I also didn't learn about William Shockley. And so this is the person credited with inventing the transistor. And I learned a lot about William Shockley when I did my undergrad at Stanford. And I learned a lot about like some anecdotes about who he is, or anecdotes about people who started Silicon Valley, like Hewitt and Packard, and how Terman lent them money when they didn't have any money, etc. But I never learned this specific information that is very important for us, right? So here are some writings by William Shockley, um, who got the Nobel Prize. And so this is extremely relevant right now, because Jeffrey Ullman just received the ACM award in computing, which is equivalent. They call it the Nobel Prize of Computer Science right now, just like this year. And Jeffrey Ullman, also a professor at Stanford. I guess he is emeritus now, but he's still teaching. You could just until recently, he had a whole website dedicated to FAQs about Iranians, for instance. A lot in the Iranian community was just understood that they weren't getting into Stanford because of this guy. Even the students who were there talked about how traumatic it was just to see him in the hallway, or what kind of effect he had in them. He talked about Native Americans, and basically was like, oh, why were Native Americans colonized? Well, it's normal. Technologically more advanced society just you know call it always replaces a technologically less advanced society, etc. So in fact, actually, there's a letter right now, a petition for the ACM to clarify, to make more transparent its decision making process in these awards right now, so that you can sign. I forgot, I don't have the link with me, so if you're interested, you can read the letter and sign. Anyways, that's to say that some of these people who get the highest honors in these fields have been advancing some of the worst societal some of the worst ideas in society. And obvious, and this is not new. So I also never learned when I was at Stanford how tech institutions and labs, whether they're in academic or industry, made their money. And like I said, their connections to wars, for instance, their connections to other practices that are problematic. So here's one example. This is an article about some of what I'm talking about here. This article talks about how, similar to how some universities in the US are coming to terms with their connection to slavery and how they benefited from it, they should also have a similar reckoning with their connection to human suffering around the world and international conflicts. So basically, I didn't learn about labor history. I didn't learn about the only thing I learned at Stanford is that Stanford, had a huge role in creating Silicon Valley, encourages startups, and we're all, innovators, and we're special, and that's kind of the end of it. So all of that type of, people say separate the person from the art, or separate the person from the work, and all of this kind of understanding of how science and technology is separate from whatever is happening in the world, or it's separate from the person doing it. It's called the view from nowhere. And Black feminists, queer feminists have been critiquing this view from nowhere, and feminists in general, for a long, long time. So this is the feeling that there's some sort of objective truth out there, or science is done from no one's point of view, and that your point of view doesn't really affect the work that you're doing, and that's false. And I believe that a lot of the issues we're seeing right now with respect to algorithmic bias or ethics or algorithmic harm more generally, I believe that a lot of that originates from this quote unquote view from nowhere. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So before that, recommend some of these. This particular interview by Sabelo, who talks about how the Western conception of ethics really is very seeps into everything we do in AI. So he gives this example, for instance, that Leibniz was who was building on ideas from Raymond Lull, who thought he could derive a symbolic language to let him build a logic machine to convert Muslims into Christianity through reason. So I get, again, this notion that, you know, your views about society don't affect the work that you're doing, and therefore the outcome of that work is really not true. So in my, for me, being a good engineer meant that I have to decouple whoever I was, whatever I felt, whatever I experienced in life, from my quote unquote technical work. And so if I ever showed a kind of a deviation from that, and I sort of started to mix it, I would be considered, you know, not neutral enough, not a good scientist. And so that's what I tried to do during my PhD. I tried to make sure that people didn't see me as quote unquote an activist, because I wanted to be respected as a scientist. And I don't care anymore, obviously. I think it might be kind of obvious now. But so so this happens to me still. And not that I, you know, I think being an activist is a very important thing. It's a very noble thing to do, and it's one of the most important things we can do in life. But the way that people describe me as an activist is not when they want to, usually it's not when they want to give me a compliment. It's usually when they're trying to separate me out from other groups of people. So this happened to me at Caltech, for instance, when I gave a talk. And so El Mahdi, who is, well, he's Moroccan and lives in Switzerland, is I guess, or now he's moved to France. He's a professor at École Polytechnique in France, and he used to be a journalist before he did his PhD in computer science. And actually, currently, his friends who are journalists are in jail, and one of them is going through a hunger strike at the moment, and you know they're being targeted by authoritarian governments. And so he talks a lot about how many times when authoritarian governments talk about journalists, they try to separate out those who they consider to be activists from those who they consider to be journalists. And they usually do that because they want to target the journalists that they call activists. And so they want the general public to say, oh, no, that's not a journalist, that's an activist. And so then it's okay that we target them. So usually it's a mechanism by which you categorize and target people. But on the other hand, a lot of people talk about, you know, interdisciplinarity and how that's really important, and how it's really important to bring knowledge from other disciplines into machine learning. So for instance, people always talk about, you know, physics-based models or ideas from game theory. And my question is, so why not ideas from history or critical race theory or anthropology? And I think this goes back to the fact that it's gatekeeping and the hierarchy of knowledge. And gatekeeping is always done by those who are in power um, to those who are not in power, right? So this one example here is Mar Hicks, who's a tech historian, wrote this book, Programmed Inequality, that talks about how the early computers were women, and all of a sudden, you know, when with the advent of the personal computing, when it started to become a very lucrative profession, it all of a sudden started to be advertised as something for men and not women at all, right? And whereas before that, they would even try to make the advertisements feminine, etc. So like I said, gatekeeping is always done by those in power. And so of course, there's always people who are combating this gatekeeping and this hierarchy of knowledge. So there's a lot of examples in decolonizing history, decolonizing art. For instance, a lot of history in indigenous communities is oral history, right? It's passed down through generations. So for instance, in my history, I learn a lot about what transpired through poetry that my mom tells me, or other members of my family tell me, or some other oral histories. And in South Africa, there's a lot of that happening, for instance, decolonizing history. So in my work, most recently, what I've been doing is trying to bring ideas that are mostly based outside of my current discipline to my current discipline. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time giving a few examples of that. So the first one is data sheets from electronics. So like I said, I used to be an analog circuit designer. I'm going to check on the chat really quickly just to make sure that there's a lot of questions, but I'll answer. I'll answer later. Okay. I just wanted to make sure there's nothing I need to attend to. But there is data sheets from electronics is one of my works. And okay, yeah. And so here's so I that's an idea from analog circuit design. So the idea of data sheets is this: in electronics, you have a data sheet for each component. So let's say I want to buy a particular component and I want to design it into my system. I would go see the data sheet that tells me the standard operating characteristics, what it shouldn't be used for, and how these characteristics change across time, etc. And there's a similar idea that we have called model cards for model reporting, whose lead author is Meg Mitchell, my co-lead, who also got fired from Google. And so what we want to do for data sheets is kind of have that kind of information for the data sets that you might gather and annotate that are used to either train machine learning models or evaluate on them. And same for model cards would be a similar thing for a model. So let's say I have a particular model. What should it be used for? What should it not be used for? How does it work for different demographic groups, etc. And we call it disaggregated testing. And I'll talk a little bit more about disaggregated testing later. Another idea is bringing ideas from archives from history. So interventions data collection from history. And that's led by Unso, who is an archivist, a historian. And so what we try to do is bring lessons from archives to machine learning. So archives are the oldest disciplines that have been dealing with human data. And actually, just most recently, some people were commenting. They were saying, machine learning and AI in general deals a lot with categorization and document. And now people are starting to talk about documentation. Why are they ignoring all these works from the library sciences? Well, a lot of it has to do with gender dynamics. The like I said, gatekeeping and the hierarchy of knowledge. There is a lot of knowledge in the library sciences, and Sophia Noble actually talks about this in algorithms of oppression, algorithms of oppression. So there's a lot of ideas that we have in the library sciences that we could learn from, but it's many times ignored because of this hierarchy of knowledge. So this idea is to take the rigor that people in archives the rigor with which they plan out their data annotation collection mechanisms and see what we can learn from there. And finally, understanding of race and gender. So this is work by Joy Buolamwini, and right, who has encoded bias, and and founded the Algorithmic Justice League and everything. And so this work here, what I'm showing is the error rate, so if you look at APIs that look at someone's face and they ascribe a gender, and this is a binary gender, male or female. So we already know that, your assumption that somebody's ideas about the world don't seep into the science is already breaking down, because this API already assumes that there's a binary gender that can be ascribed, that you can tell someone's face when you look at them and can ascribe a particular gender, that it doesn't change across time and space, that it is not culturally, relevant, etc. So if you were to do this, a coin flip and guess someone's gender, you would get 50% random chance accuracy, right? But here we see that the darker and darker you go in the skin type for women, that you start going to this random chance accuracy. And the key ideas here were using skin type rather than race, because race is an unstable social construct across space and time. And Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, ideas of intersectionality. So disaggregated testing, rather than have one measure of accuracy, or testing it by either, skin type, just only skin type, or gender. Look at disaggregated testing, in this case by skin type and gender. And so we can see the highest disparities in areas that we saw were for darker skinned women, which is a microcosm of the fact that Black women are always at the bottom of the totem pole when we talk about equity. Okay, so another work is ideas for diversity and inclusion. So actually, I'm not going to go through this very much, but I wish I could. Maybe during the Q&A, I'll put a link on the chat. But we have an interactive website called an Explorable that we worked with a data visualization team called Pair, that shows some of these ideas. So here the question is, if you were to do image search, and we know image search had a lot of issues. So for instance, when people search for unprofessional hair, you get Black women's hair, right? You used to, at least. So when you look at search results, or when you look at a subset and you try to select the most diverse and inclusive subset from a larger set, so that would be, for instance, if I get image search results, how do I select the most quote unquote diverse and inclusive results? These are such complicated kind of concepts, right? And how do you measure them? And so this is a paper where we have a number of different people, authors with varying backgrounds, from econ to organizational social science, etc., where we write about this. And so I'll later link a chat to a, again, like I said, visualization that helps people understand these concepts more. So in the last, let's say 13 minutes, I want to talk about what made these, what makes for an effective, I would say, research work. And in my opinion, out of the works that at least I was involved in, the ones that were most effective were effective because of a number of reasons. And the first one for me is to build on the foundation of building a house before figuring out the decorations. So for instance, data sheets, model cards, etc., these works were about process. They weren't about, having a new algorithm or a novel this or whatever bells and whistles. We were like, there is a foundation that's missing. There is a process that's missing. And so we want to first work on that. The second one is to focus on impact. And so, for instance, with model cards, Meg Mitchell, my co-lead, we were still all working on it 2 years, more than that after releasing the paper. So we were working on, we convinced Google to come up with a model card for an existing model that they were actually using, an API that they were selling, and that took forever to do. And so that's just one example. Another one is to work with people who have domain expertise and who understand the context. So for instance, Gender Shades, Joy's work was a great example of that. The only reason she was able to come up with this work was because she was a darker skinned woman who was working with some random open source face detection software that wouldn't detect her face, but also understands the real world consequences of categorization and race and gender. Another one is collective movements. So one example here is Deborah Raji. So Joy and I worked on Gender Shades, and that was Joy's master's thesis. And so we took a part of it and published it. And then Deb and Joy worked on a follow-up study called Actionable Auditing. And once they worked on this paper, one of the things that this paper did was it showed that Amazon's recognition tool, which they used to sell to law enforcement, they have a moratorium now, can have similar biases to the ones that we showed in Gender Shades. So what I mean is similar biases to this one here, where the darker and darker skin tone for Black women, the disparity in error rates is really, really high. So what does it mean to be selling this kind of thing to law enforcement? First of all, even if it was working perfectly well, you shouldn't be selling it to law enforcement. But what does it mean to be selling something like this to law enforcement? So this paper came out, this article came out, VP after VP at Amazon started attacking Deb and Joy. So Deb was an undergrad at the time, Joy was a grad student. And so what did we do? My colleague Meg and I wrote a point-by-point rebuttal. We spent 1 month doing this to the attacks that the VPs made. And we asked a number of academics to help us edit and to sign an open letter to Amazon asking them to stop selling recognition to law enforcement. And some of those people were Turing Award winners and others. And so it was all over the news, and they couldn't get away with attacking these women, these Black women. And recently, actually, after I got fired at MIT, Dr. Caitlin Turner, Catherine D'Ignazio, who co-wrote Data Feminism, and Professor Daniel Wood wrote the Abuse and Misogyny Playbook. And it talks about how what happened to me fits into this playbook of how Black women have been discredited across time, over history, and how this. And so they talk about the fact that what happened to me is just it fits neatly into how they treat Black women historically. So the reason I wanted to give this as an example is that it was very important that Deb stayed in this field to take this kind of risk, as an undergrad, to do this kind of important work, and to be attacked by VPs after VPs of this huge company that's Amazon. Many people wouldn't take that risk, and especially if it's not people from the communities that are being most harmed. So Deb told me that she was gonna completely leave the field until she came to Black and AI. So Black and AI is an organization I co-founded with my colleague Redita Bebe, and there's a lot of people who are just very, very active in Black and AI. So you can go to blackandai.org to learn more about it. And so Deb said that, so in 2017, I think when she found Black and AI, she was ready to leave. She was there's too much isolation, being the only one, too much discrimination. She just didn't want to. She just couldn't do it anymore. And she found Black and AI, and she decided to stay because she got a lot of support, and she was able to be unapologetic in her Black womanhood. So these collective movements that we're building are extremely important as a foundation to be able to do all of this other work to make sure that we're not enabling technology that harms our communities. Joy is another example. She founded the Algorithmic Justice League, and that is a form of, I believe, a collective movement. And she also is, she communicates in all possible forms the research results. One is art, so you have Coded Bias, the documentary that is doing an amazing job of telling this whole story and helping people understand why they should care about it. And one is spoken word. So she have all sorts of poems, like AI and Ain't I a Woman is one, and she actually performed at Afropunk a couple of years ago, I remember. She has exhibitions all over the world, art exhibitions that describe the same exact idea. So she stays with the same work and works on legislation, art, documentaries, research papers, anything you can think of. And she's been extremely effective. And so these are all different modes of communication. I'm not going to go through this, but because we have about 5 minutes. So all of these that I was talking about are apparently similar stuff was covered in this keynote called Machine Learning That Matters in 2012, and by Kiri Wagstaff. And what she says is that there are all these things that we need to do to work on machine learning that matters, but for some reason, the thing that is most valued in these conferences is to choose an algorithm or develop metrics or conduct an experiment. And why is that? And I think it's because of the so I'm gonna skip this too, and that happens to me too. Like many times, people say, "Oh, but what has she really done in computer vision? What's really the algorithmic component of her work?" And I ask always, "Why is that?" And it's again, it's because of the hierarchy of knowledge that devalues work that is with respect to gathering and annotating data sets. So, for instance, this book called Ghost Work by Mary Gray and Siddhartha Suri talks about how Silicon Valley and all of these, elite AI institutions are creating an underclass of people around the world, because all of this work is powered by data annotation, and all of these people who are doing this data work are not well paid at all. They can't make a living, and their work is devalued. And so, but at the same time, there's a lot of issues with data sets that are used in, for instance, in computer vision and other fields. So here's some works by Vinay Prabhu and Ababa Burhane that talk about how some of these practices in data collection and annotation have resulted in real tangible harm, especially to people marginalized communities and especially to Black women. Other works are by Emily Denton and Alex Hanna in my former team. So for instance, Emily has this talk, Critical Perspectives in Computer Vision. And then we see a lot of these works on like Make X Fair or Race Science is one. And then many entire computer science communities excluding people at the margins while they are working on quote unquote fairness, but they're not collaborating with these communities and they're suppressing these communities' voices, right? So that's basically what happened to me at Google. They're like, oh yeah, we want you to work on ethics, whatever. But when I actually tried to use my voice and write a peer-reviewed paper, some guys in power said, oh no, sorry, that's not, that is below our publication bar. And then you have these ethics boards without inclusion of people at the margins. So they got the memo that you should have all of these ethics boards, et cetera, but not including many people at the margins. So here's an example. There's some articles here about how, like at Google, same thing. They have all of these ethics boards, but how many people at the margins do they have? And that's not just an example at Google. It's also at all of these elite institutions. If you see who's getting all of the money to work on quote unquote fairness and bias, it is all of these elite institutions without a single Black person leading anything. So finally, I was asked by Petra Purna, like I said, at at Caltech when I was giving a talk, who told me I was weaving in and out of science and activism or whatever. And he was worried about curiosity-based research if I'm talking about, some things should not exist. So whose curiosity-based research are we funding? And curiosity-based research can be harmful if only some people's voices are being heard. So one example here is gender recognition. Many people in the trans community have gender recognition systems of the type that Joy and I analyze, and basically Joy analyzed and I help advise. People in the trans community especially have written about how harmful these gender recognition systems could be to people in their community. So to conclude, I mean, the assumption that people's position in society is not affecting the research they do is false. And I think it's a pretty big reason why we have some of these issues that we have in this field. And I think it's really important. It's not just an academia versus industry issue. And I think it's really important to change how these disciplines are taught and what we value in schools, companies, and conferences. And it affects all forms of research, curiosity or otherwise. And I wanted to close by showing like some of these books that I was that were on my shelf when I was an undergrad and when I was doing my master's, etc. They're all about, signal processing, electromagnetics, whatever. And these are the books I didn't read. So you have here by Charlton McLean, Black Software, books by Ruha, who was already here, Algorithms of Oppression by Safia Noble, Ruined by Design, Sorting Things Out, which I still haven't read, but I have it because the social scientists in my former team were telling me it's a very fundamental book about how categorizing things in the world affects society. Haben Girma is the first deafblind person to graduate from Harvard, and she is a huge advocate for disability rights and accessibility in tech. Simone Brown wrote Dark Matters and talks about how the history of surveillance in the US is tied to technology. And Meredith Broussard, Artificial Intelligence. And that's it. I'm going to stop for questions.
Wow. I feel like one of the things that we lose in this Zoom world is like the round of applause, but you can kind of see it coming in the chat. Like that was unbelievable. I definitely want to get to the questions, but a couple of things I do want to point out. And I want to first thank the attendees who have helped me as you've been presenting. We've been trying to share as many of the resources that you referenced in the chat. So thank you everybody who's been helping me find the links for the resources, because we want to make sure that everybody has them. We'll also link all the resources on our website.
Okay.
So jumping into the Q&A, I'm actually going to start with this second question. It says, how does bias conceptually link to power in knowledge? Could one say that bias is an expression of power in knowledge?
Oh man, that's a really interesting question. I don't even know, honestly, if sometimes the word bias, I think, is a little distracting to us. So like when we talk about algorithmic bias, for instance, some statistics people will be like, oh, but you need to have some bias or whatever, other people. So I like talking about power, like that this person just, I don't know who asked this question. So actually, shifting Riha Kaluri Power, who actually started working on a group called Radical AI, talks about, has this Nature article called Shifting Power. And she actually says, we should not talk about bias, should not talk about fairness. We should talk about shifting power. And I think a lot of these issues are about who has power. So for instance, even if you remove bias, right? So when we talk about face recognition, Joy's work and my work first showed that there are these huge disparities in error rates when we talk about face recognition. And you can ask, first of all, why do these disparities in error rates exist? Well, it could be that a lot of the data sets that are used are on the internet, and who's most represented on the internet is who has power. And so, sure, that can, if you just scrape what's on the internet, you can have this quote unquote bias. And then the bias of the person who's scraping it or whatever says, okay, fine, like whatever bias I have, it's fine, it's good enough, I'll ship it. That's one. But then even if you didn't have any of this bias, it worked perfectly well, uh, perfectly well on everybody. You still have who has power to use it on whom, right? And so you can have a technology that works perfectly well, but it's still used against to marginalize Black and Brown communities, not to lift them up. And so that's about power. So I guess I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that, like, because sometimes I don't like the term bias because it feels like it's passive. It's just like bias. Racism is not passive. Power is not passive, and I think we should shift that conversation towards those not terms that are not passive. And
So I think,
Brandy's
I
will
mean, I
say
think,
that for the
yeah.
people in in at Spelman. She will be
From
the first
Spelman.
person, yeah, who says this. Yeah.
So I think you did a great job answering. I'm going to add this follow-up question from another person because I think maybe it will help for anybody that's not clear. Because you just talked about that even if this system works perfectly as it was designed, it's who has control. So Douglas Erner asked, I'm not immediately making the connection. Could you say more about why facial recognition technology should not be sold to police, even if it was working perfectly?
It's because of what it's being used for. So imagine, so I want to give this example of, okay, um, people have mobile phones, have smartphones now, right? And so they're filming what's happening. Oh man, and I can't even believe it. Just 2 days ago, Dante Wright, right? Like it's just
Mm,
it's a barrage of what they're doing. So, but people are filming them. And, many people are filming what happened, George Floyd's killing. What if they weren't filming them? So at least this technology is allowing, it's I think it's allowing a little bit of an equalizing of power, because the bystanders have the same amount of power to surveil the police than the other way forward. But face recognition, um, it's usually the police who have all of the data on you, all of this, whatever they're using on you, and what is their purpose. It all comes down to what's the purpose that people are using this thing for. If I was to believe that these institutions are really for my benefit, then maybe them having this amount of power over me might be okay. But currently we're seeing that it's abuse after abuse of power. So actually I have another talk where I go into this a lot more. So it's like, well, this technology is amplifying what people do at scale, their intentions at scale, right? So one
mm,
example I can give you is, there was this picture at Life magazine during World War II, where people were trying to teach others how to distinguish between Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, because
mm.
presumably you want to target Japanese Americans because it's World War II and you hate them and you think they're all the enemy, and go target them, go do whatever you want, but don't do that to Chinese Americans. And now let's talk about face recognition. It allows you to do this at scale. Like in China, they have face surveillance systems that are advertised as
Mm,
being able to target Muslim minorities, right? At
mm,
scale, at scale. So you can do this wherever you want. So whatever technology you have, when it's in the hands of institutions that are really not in your have shown that their interest is not aligned with yours, you're giving them more power to do this. So in face surveillance, that's what's going on with police. They're not they're not using it for the benefit of Black and Brown communities. It has time and time again been shown to be harming these communities, and there's no transparency right now. We don't even have guardrails right now. They can use it however they want, in whatever form they want. So
Mhm.
actually, I was reading the perpetual lineup report. It's a perpetual lineup. I'm sorry, I'm giving a long answer here because I have a whole talk about it, right? Like, so I understand it because it's not straightforward. Because when someone asks me why shouldn't we build a bomb, it's clear because like, well, its own use. The only use is to kill people. So like,
Mhm.
but when people say why shouldn't we build face surveillance systems, it's not clear because like, it's not clear that it's used to just kill people. You can't say the same
Mhm.
thing. So it's kind of more complicated, I think. So the perpetual lineup report, for instance, talked about how is it 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 American adults? I think it's 1 in 2 American adults are in a face surveillance system used by
Wow.
the authorities, however they can use it, right? Now we're seeing a lot of laws being passed, like San Francisco, Oakland, Boston, Somerville, etc. And I think national and state bills are in discussion. But back then, but I mean, still, they can use it however they want. This kind of disparities and error rates that we can talk about can exist, not exist. They don't have to tell us why or how they're using these systems. They can use it in court to as evidence or whatever. Laura Moy is a lawyer who knows more about that. Who and then so when they wrote this perpetual lineup report in 2016, the Georgetown law people asked for regulation. But then they had a follow-up report called America Under Watch that was in 2019. They didn't ask for regulation, they asked for a moratorium now because it was just being used and abused in many ways. And so there was just no regulation anymore. We need to have a moratorium first. And so that's just this long-winded sort of answer as to why. And I understand the complexity of it because it's not like, I'm saying don't have a gun.
So I want to stick with that line though, and shift from not necessarily the use of the technology, but the creators of the technology. So this question comes from Brittany Braxton, who asks, "It feels like the harm of AI still is outweighed by the amount of money a company can gain. This imbalance is this imbalance is faced with a race to profit from it as much as possible until there's an eventual backlash. How can we as technologists push back on the insistence to use these tools even when millions of dollars are being made?"
Again, I think it's about power because what I've learned is that people can be as well-meaning as they want. The leaders of these companies or whoever you're talking about in power can be as well-meaning as they want, but they don't have to listen to you and unless you have some amount of power, some sort of power, right? So, as individuals, we have to have like some amount of power that makes it such that our voices and demands need to be heard. So that means regulation.
Mm.
So we need to exercise even with legislation. We don't have as much power. I mean, you have okay, I don't understand lobbying and how it works because it feels like just legal bribery to me. But that's the thing. Like, it's all legislation is supposed to be where we all have our voices, but we don't because like these huge companies, they know exactly, they have all the time in the world to learn about what regulation is going to be passed and what's going to be in their interest versus not, and then they hire other people who have all the time in the world to fight against these things, right? But then on the other hand, you have the Brooklyn tenants, right, who were fighting against face surveillance in their own system. They don't have all day to learn about all of this stuff, and then they don't have all day to fight. They don't have all the money to hire all of these people in legislation, but they were at least fighting back. So I think the first thing is that we have to learn about these issues. We have to engage our legislators, and we have to have some meaningful legislation. And when I say meaningful legislation, I don't mean
Mm.
legislation that these companies are out there and they're gonna, they write the legislation like the pharmaceutical companies, and then that's passed. Because, like you said, if the only motive that the companies are going, to follow is profit, there needs to be
Mhm.
something that balances that. They're not going to do it of their own volition. And I see this in anti-discrimination cases too. Like they have no incentive to not mistreat workers, because right now, after all of this fighting, and they make your life miserable. Like you can see Chelsea Glasson, who's fighting pregnancy discrimination at Google. She's been fighting it for 3 years, and they're making their life, I mean, hell. And what's what is success after all this? Maybe the NLRB 1 year later, 2 years later says that, oh, this was wrong. And they say like, maybe you need to pay $2 million to like 50 people. That's not punishment for Google. So they're going to continue to do it. So I think, yeah, these are the things, in my opinion, that we need to do. We need to have better whistleblower protection, better stronger anti-discrimination laws, algorithmic oversight, etc. But then, but the law shouldn't be written by the lobbyists of the corporations.
Beautiful. So we have time for one more question, and the question I've selected is to bring it back to our Spelman students. So our question is, what advice would you give to students hoping to change the balance of power in tech? Or what do you wish you had known as a student being taught about the view from nowhere?
When I'm going to give you a long answer. So when I came to the States at 16, and I had, I had my first day of school, and this chemistry teacher was just like, you came from another country, a hard class, whatever. And I was just like, okay, what is going on? And then the racism, the way I experienced it was just, it's so deep seated. I didn't understand. Like there was just so much I didn't understand. Like, oh yeah, I learned about racism and stuff, but how it manifested itself. And then I go to high school and I learned the history, and it's just like, does not compute with what I'm experiencing. It's just not, it doesn't, imagine you're an immigrant and you come here and, you've learned about stuff, but then you're experiencing it. And then the history that they're teaching you just does not make sense with whatever I'm experiencing. It is just really not, and then I go to Stanford and they're like, oh, you got in because of affirmative action. I'm like, do you have any idea what I just went through in my high school, And so I had to seek it out. I had to be like, I need to take some classes. Like I need to take classes on civil rights in the 20th century and all that. And then I was like, okay, that makes sense. What I learned just there makes sense. But I mean, who is going to seek this out? Like you need to have people on the same page. There's no change that can be done had in the US if one group of people are learning some like history that said, yeah, Black people were immigrants and yeah, it wasn't that bad. It's over now, we had this thing. How is and so similarly speaking, in terms of this view and so in history too, right? Like they don't drill into you that who writes it just completely changes what history you learn about, whose views are being expressed in history. It's a similar thing in science. Who writes it and their views completely changes the course of technology and science. And so both, not just in science but in history, that's the kind of stuff I would want to be drilled into me from day one, whether it's middle school or high school or whatever. I want exercises that show me that oh, when you have this person doing it versus this person, the outcome is different. When you have history from this point of view versus this point of view, it's completely different. That's what I would like to see. And I'd like to see so Nikki Washington has this class at Duke, I guess, that I haven't been able to take. I wish I could take it on tech and race and gender. I don't remember the title of it, but she goes through all of these books that I was talking about, Simone Brown's Dark Matter stuff. She talks about lantern laws, and I didn't even know about this. Lantern laws in New York, where Black, Latin, Indigenous, and mixed people had to walk around with lanterns at night, and so that's the kind of class that everybody needs to take. And it needs to be required for computer science students. Now you're going to do that, and then you're going to have all the backlash, all the there's the right is extremely organized. And so there was this article, Campus Reformer. I don't know if you guys have read about this. So Chandra Scott, Prescott, who is one of the few, or maybe only, Black women who is a theoretical physicist. I just bought her book called The Disordered Cosmos. She just, I just saw an article that she posted, which was horrible. So there is this article called I guess publication called Campus Reformer or something like that, and they are super organized. What they try to do is target these professors and academics that they think are woke or whatever, liberal, whatever. So for each of these things that you do that I'm talking about, the backlash is so huge. We always have to think, okay, what do we do such that the backlash still, even with all of that backlash, we're still gonna do, it's much better to do this than not.
Wow. We could talk for another hour. We have still so many questions in the Q&A, but we're going to have to wrap it up here. Dr. Gebru, this has been outstanding, outstanding. The passion that you have, not only for AI, but for social justice, is inspiring. So I want to thank you again for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be a part of the Spelman community today. And I am hopeful that once we are back in person, we can invite you back to be on campus with us. I know that our students would love to learn more from you. To everybody, thank you for attending today. I truly appreciate your participation in today's conversation with Dr. Gebru. And I look forward to seeing everybody at our next talk, which will be next week with Drs. LaTanya Sweeney and
Oh,
Raquel Hill,
amazing.
who will be wrapping up this semester talking about why specifically the Black community needs to be more engaged in the fight for social justice related to technology. So with that, I will leave you and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.